I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast Supplement. Today, Rob, we are looking at what book?
We're looking at an entire book given over to the translation of one poem over and over again.
A whole book on one poem. And it's not a particularly long poem.
No, it's not a particularly long poem. Not a particularly long book either.
No, it's quite a short book. It's a little bit older. It's a tough book to find. So we're looking at 19 Ways of Looking at Wang Wei by Eliot, Weinberger, and Octavio Paz.
Yes. So that is significantly older than what a lot of the stuff we'll cover because Octavio Paz is involved.
And we were kind of talking about this. So this book was published in 1987. It's really interesting in terms of translation studies, Rob, which is more of your wheelhouse.
It kind of is, although this is less interesting from a translation study standpoint than just a understanding how translation works standpoint. One of the really strong parts of this book is you can really see why very small decisions in translation can make such a huge difference. Yeah. Rather than just say taking two translations of Du Fu poems and comparing, and you've got 19 to work with.
And we should explain these translations are done by various people. There's one translation that's just a kind of word for word translation, which doesn't make any sense. There's another there are 2 or 3 translations in French, right, Rob?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There's one into Spanish, which Octavio Paz is a native Spanish speaker. I think he also speaks English quite well at an academic level, but he is a native Spanish speaker, and his Chinese is his second or third language. So it's really a fascinating way to look at this one poem and see that there are 19 completely different ways to talk about it.
And, if you're just coming at this as a rookie, someone who doesn't actually translate any of the stuff and can't read it into Chinese, some of the translations, you're not going to see a huge difference, or you may find yourself going, yeah, I don't actually see why that's such a big deal. And fair enough. But others, you're going to see a huge difference, especially when translators start saying, I'm just going to render this exactly the way it sounds to me in my head, right? And it is very different. One of the things I found really interesting about this, as someone who speaks French, is seeing how in French it's in some ways a lot easier to translate some of the particularities of sort of Tang poetry. Because, of course, one of the things that's fascinating about poetry from this era is there's very rarely a subject. You very rarely get an "I saw flowers growing." There's a lot of flexibility here. You can see I was in the forest doing this thing, or you can just see in the forest a thing happened, right? There's a lot of possibilities for that. And I personally, this is a personal preference, like when the subject is not there, partially because it's very unique. You don't often see that in a lot of poetry.
In English.
Yes. But in French...
In Chinese, it's quite common
yes,
for the subject not
absolutely.
to be there. And that's part of the trouble about rendering the any kind of Chinese poetry into English, is that it's just really hard to get this sense. Like in English, you just have to have some sort of pronoun or something at the very beginning.
Yes. Yeah.
Or it sounds weird. Rob, is it okay if I read 2 example poems from the book?
Go for it.
So the first one is by W.J.B. Fletcher. He translated this poem in 1919.
Well, hang on a second. You should definitely tell him what the poem is first.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, we completely forgot about that. So the poem is called Lü Zhai, and that's just kind of, Rob, do you want to help me out here?
Sometimes translated Deer Park.
Deer Park, yeah. It's really kind of it's hard to kind of Deer Cage, maybe?
Deer Park is a suburb of Houston, but I'm pretty sure he's not writing about that.
I didn't know Wang Wei was also an oilman.
He's a traveler. He's been around. But if you read through the book, you'll see it's translated a lot of different ways. But for the sake of reference, Deer Park is probably a good way to think about it.
Yeah. So poem number 4 in this book is W.J.B. Fletcher's 1919 translation, and he titles this poem "The Form of the Deer." So here is his more verbose translation. So lone seems the hills, there is no one in sight there, but whence is the echo of voices I hear? The rays of the sunset pierce slanting the forest, and in their reflection green mosses appear. And then I'm going to read number 14. And Rob, is it okay if we just kind of compare those?
Yeah.
So this is a 1973 translation by G.W. Robinson. He just called it Deer Park, which I think is probably the best way to translate Liu Jai. And here is his translation of Deer Park. Hills empty, no one to be seen. We hear only voices echoed, with light coming back into the deep woods. The top of the green moss is lit again.
So you'll notice the difference right off the bat of the one has a little more of a presence, of a narrative presence, I, we, and the other one's kind of scales it back a little bit.
Yeah, and the 1919 translation is really trying to be more of a... Rob, do you think it almost sounds like a sonnet, like it's trying to be a Shakespearean sonnet, or is something weird going on where it's trying to place this Chinese poem in a tradition of English language poetry that is not there in the poem?
Well, and that's one of the
original
tendencies in a lot of older translators is to go, look, people are used to reading poetry in a certain way. Let's give them a version of that so that they're able to appreciate the poem, right? Because if we just render it exactly as it is in Chinese, it's not going to register for most people as poetry. And this is, of course, the long-standing battle, right? Do we give people the poem as it appears to be on the page, or do we give people the poem in a way that they'll go, "Oh, wow, that was a poem"?
And Rob, these debates come up again and again in translation studies.
Forever.
Am I correct?
Oh yeah. A lot of it comes in. You get into discussions about ownership. Well, who has the right to determine that? Right? Is it your poem? It's from China. It's a Chinese poem. Who cares what you think? Right? Go ahead.
I was going to ask you, Rob. I mean, you're a translation studies specialist. You're writing your dissertation on translation studies. To a certain degree, that's one aspect of your dissertation. Which poem do you favor, and kind of which poetic philosophy do you favor? Do you think you should render the Chinese into English as if it's Chinesey, or should it be more Englishy?
And for the listener, Chinesey is the technical term.
That's a technical term, just like Englishy.
Yeah.
Englishy is also a technical term.
Yeah. So,
but I mean, should it sound like it's coming? Should it sound like it's being translated? Should it sound like it's this native Chinese poem?
Honestly, I don't really care all that much. For me, it's such a personal preference thing. When I mentioned last time, one of the reasons that the last supplement we did was on A Little Primer of Tufu by David Hawkes is because he's the only one I'm aware of who translates Dufu the way I hear Dufu, which is as prose poetry. Dufu does not sound the way a lot of these translations present him. And it's hard to explain how that is. But, as someone who really wishes more people would read more Chinese literature, I'm all for rendering in a way that makes people go, wow, that's definitely a poem, right? I mean, obviously you don't want to throw a ton of your own language in there, but I'm kind of flexible with this sort of thing. I think there are people who toe a much firmer line, but actually in this book, my favorites are the French translations, partly because...
Sacre bleu.
Right, but it's partly because... in French, you have a pronoun, which is on, and that's a very neutral pronoun. It's not he, it's not she, it's not...
It's kind of like the they in English is we're kind of degendering our language to a certain degree.
And what's useful about it in this context is you can have a poem with no real subject, but also have a pronoun. So you have something to latch onto, but it also gives you the effect of reading it in Chinese. We're kind of getting into the weeds a little bit here, but the reason we chose this book is because
we're in Oregon, Rob. That's what we get into.
That's very true, actually. There's a lot of it. And as spring arrives, we're going to get a lot more of that because allergy season is going to come sooner than
I was talking about a different kind of weed.
Oh, well, yeah, that too. There's a lot of weed and weeds in Oregon. Not literary weeds so much, but actual weed and weeds. This may not be the sort of book that most people are going to want to wade through, but it is a fascinating read because you get a front row seat of just how many different ways there are to read this stuff. Tang poetry is phenomenally hard to translate because of all these considerations.
It's phenomenally hard to translate well because it's so easy to translate. You can kind of do whatever you want with it. It's so flexible.
Yes.
When you translate it it kind of, it's hard, like once you kind of bring it out of the box of the very technical bound Chinese poetic nature that you have in the original, it kind of, you can do whatever you want with it, which is a good thing and a bad thing. And I think that's one of the things that I love so much about Weinberger and Paz's 19 Ways of Looking at Wang Wei. It shows you that flexibility, and each of the poems comes with a kind of description. So you have the translation on one page, and then you'll have a description of what this poem is doing, what the authors think is good and what the authors think is bad about this translation.
And they're very good notes. They're usually very, very brief, no more than 1 or 2 or 3 paragraphs. And they usually zero right in on exactly why the poem is interesting.
And as we start to wrap this up, I think that this is a great resource for anyone who's looking at thinking about Chinese poetry, Tang poetry, particularly in terms of translation. It's a little bit dated, but it's still a fascinating resource. If you can find it in a library or on Amazon, which, by the way, we should just kind of mention, if you buy it through our website, we may get a commission. We're supposed to say that.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating way of looking at Tang poetry by looking at 19 different ways that this one single poem by Wang Wei, who is the least popular of the 3 most popular Tang Dynasty poets, looking at this one single poem, which is fairly influential in Chinese literature, right, Rob?
Yes. Check it out if you can. We haven't even mentioned it yet, but it's a very, very, very short book.
It's super short.
It's 19 translations, and it's a one paragraph, 4 stanza poem. So you can read the whole book in 30 minutes if you want, or you can spend a lot more time just kind of looking over the changes in each one. So it's a really neat resource.
Yeah, 51 pages. This is going to take you a very short time to read.
Yep.
All right, I think that's a great place to call it.
Yep.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.